Andy Wilder stood at the edge of his property, a morning sun warming his weathered face as he surveyed the natural depression in the land. For 3 generations, his family had worked this 200-acre ranch in Wyoming's Medicine Bow Mountains, raising cattle and tending to the land with a careful stewardship that had been passed down from father to son. At 57, the furrows in Andy's brow had deepened, not just from age, but from years of battling drought conditions that threatened his livelihood. "This is the spot," he said to himself, nodding with certainty as he kicked at the dusty soil with his worn leather boot. For years, Andy had dreamed of building a pond on his ranch. Not just any pond, but a sustainable water source that would serve multiple purposes, irrigating his hay fields during increasingly dry summers, providing water for his cattle, creating a natural fire break in an area prone to wildfires, and even fostering a small ecosystem for local wildlife. It wasn't a frivolous project in Andy's mind, it was an essential investment in his ranch's future. After consulting with local environmental engineers and saving for nearly a decade, Andy had finally accumulated enough funds to break ground on the project in the spring of 2018. He'd done everything by the book, or so he thought. He'd secured the necessary state permits, hired respectable contractors familiar with ranch water projects, and even consulted with a wildlife biologist to ensure the pond would benefit the local ecosystem. "The way I see it," Andy explained to his neighbor Dale over a cup of coffee at the local diner, "this pond is going to be the lifeblood of Willwood Ranch for the next generation. My grandfather would have done the same if he faced the droughts we're seeing now." Dale nodded in agreement, understanding the struggle all too well. "Smart move, Andy. Wish I'd done something similar years ago." Construction began in April. The depression in the land was perfect, a natural bowl where snowmelt and rain already tended to collect before eventually seeping into the ground. The contractors simply needed to deepen it, build an earthen dam on the lower end, and install proper drainage systems. Andy had meticulously planned for the pond to fill naturally from an intermittent stream that crossed his property, flowing only during spring thaws and after heavy rains. By mid-June, the project was complete. Andy stood proudly at the edge of the newly constructed pond, still waiting for the summer rains to fill it to capacity. The earthen dam was sturdy, the spillway professionally constructed. He even planted native vegetation around the edges to prevent erosion and provide habitat for birds and small mammals. It was everything he'd envisioned. "Dad would have been proud," he murmured, thinking of his father who had passed away 5 years earlier. The pond represented not just practical resource management, but a continuation of the family's commitment to the land. What Andy couldn't have anticipated was the letter that arrived in his mailbox 3 weeks later bearing the insignia of the Environmental Protection Agency. He opened it casually, expecting it to be routine correspondence, perhaps related to the agricultural subsidies his ranch occasionally received. Instead, the words on the page made his blood run cold. "Notice of violation. Unauthorized discharge of fill material into waters of the United States." The letter went on to state that Andy had violated the Clean Water Act by constructing a pond that impacted a navigable water without obtaining a federal permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. The potential penalties were staggering. Civil penalties of up to $50,000 per day of violation. Andy's hands trembled as he read and reread the letter. Navigable waters. The seasonal stream that occasionally trickled through his property was barely 6 inches deep at its fullest. No boat could possibly navigate it. How could this be? "This has to be some kind of mistake," he whispered, with the official EPA letterhead, and the formal language left no doubt that this was deadly serious. Little did Andy know that this letter was just the beginning of a nightmare that would threaten everything his family had built over 3 generations. All because he built a pond on his own land to conserve water in an increasingly arid climate. Andy sat across from Sarah Landon, an attorney specializing in environmental law, in her modest office in Laramie. 3 weeks had passed since that first EPA letter, and in that time, Andy had received 2 more notices, each more threatening than the last. The most recent included language about enforcement actions and mandatory compliance. The implied financial penalties had grown from theoretical to imminent. "So let me understand this correctly," Sarah said, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed the paperwork spread across her desk. "You built this pond entirely on your private property using a seasonal stream that only flows during spring runoff and after heavy rains." Andy nodded, his callous hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "Yes, ma'am. That stream is dry 8 months out of the year. Always has been. You could step across it without getting your boots wet most times." Sarah frowned, making a note. "And you obtained all the necessary state permits?" "Every single one," Andy confirmed, sliding a folder toward her. "Wyoming State Engineer's Office approved the water rights allocation. The county signed off on the construction permits. I even had the Natural Resources Conservation Service out to advise on the design to ensure it would benefit wildlife." Sarah thumbed through the documentation, her expression growing increasingly puzzled. The problem, Mr. Wilder, is that the EPA is claiming jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act because they've determined your seasonal stream constitutes waters of the United States. That's absurd, Andy said, a flush of anger rising to his weathered cheeks. It's a trickle that doesn't even connect to any navigable river. It just disappears into the ground eventually. Sarah nodded slowly. Unfortunately, the definition of waters of the United States has been a moving target for decades. The EPA and Army courts have been expanding their interpretation to include even isolated wetlands and seasonal streams if they can establish any sort of significant nexus to traditional navigable waters. Significant nexus, Andy repeated, the legal jargon foreign to his ears. It means they're claiming your seasonal stream eventually affects a larger body of water, even if indirectly through groundwater or other means. She sighed, closing the folder. This is happening all across the country, Mr. Wilder. Farmers and ranchers building ponds, creating drainage, or even just cleaning out existing ditches are finding themselves caught in regulatory crosshairs. Andy leaned forward, his voice low but intense. Sarah, I'm a simple rancher. I'm not a wealthy man. If they enforce these fines, $50,000 a day, they'll take everything my family has built for 3 generations. The attorney's eyes softened. I understand, and I think you have a strong case, but I won't sugarcoat this. You're in for a fight, and it's David versus Goliath. 2 days later, Andy received visitors. A black SUV with government plates pulled up to his ranch house, and 2 individuals, a man in a crisp suit and a woman carrying a tablet computer, introduced themselves as EPA enforcement officers. We're here to inspect the unauthorized impoundment, the man stated flatly, handing Andy his credentials. It's a pond, Andy corrected, his jaw tight. And I've been advised by my attorney not to allow any inspections without her present. The woman's expression hardened. Mr. Wilder, obstructing our investigation will only compound your problems. We have authority under the Clean Water Act to access this property for inspection purposes. Andy stood his ground, arms crossed. I'm not obstructing anything. I'm requesting my legal representative be present. You're welcome to come back tomorrow when she can join us. The officials exchanged glances before reluctantly agreeing, but not before delivering a thinly veiled threat about uncooperative parties facing enhanced scrutiny. That evening, unable to sleep, Andy sat at his kitchen table surrounded by maps of his property, copies of permits, and photographs of the pond construction process. His neighbor Dale had stopped by with a bottle of whiskey and much-needed moral support. You know what this is really about, don't you? Dale said, pouring them each a modest glass. Control. They can't stand the idea of private landowners making decisions about their own property without a federal bureaucrat signing off. Andy sipped the whiskey, feeling its warmth spread through his chest. Maybe. All I know is I did everything right. This pond is good for the land, good for the wildlife, good for water conservation. Hell, it's even good for flood control downstream. And now they're treating me like I've committed some kind of environmental crime. Dale nodded sympathetically. What's your attorney saying? The morning sky bloomed pink and orange as Andy stood beside his pond, watching a family of mallards glide across its surface. In the 3 months since the EPA officials had first visited his ranch, the pond had developed into exactly what he'd envisioned, a thriving ecosystem and vital water source. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very feature the government wanted him to destroy was becoming a haven for the wildlife they claimed to protect. Beautiful, isn't it? Said Sarah Landon, his attorney, who had arrived early for their strategy meeting before that afternoon's court hearing. Andy nodded, his eyes never leaving the water. Hard to believe something this beneficial could cause so much trouble. The past months had been a whirlwind. After the initial inspection, the EPA had doubled down, sending Andy a formal compliance order demanding he remove the pond and restore the land to its original condition within 30 days or face those crushing daily fines. But by then, something unexpected had happened. Andy's story had gone viral. It began with a small article in the local newspaper about a rancher fighting government overreach. Someone shared it online where it caught the attention of a popular conservative radio host who invited Andy to tell his story on air. From there, it snowballed. National news outlets picked up the story. Property rights advocates rallied to his cause. The legal defense fund established in his name had already collected over $30,000 from supporters across the country. We got a strong team for today, Sarah said as they walked back toward the house. The Mountain States Legal Foundation has agreed to file an amicus brief supporting our position, and that hydrologist from the university is prepared to testify that your seasonal stream doesn't meet the legal definition of waters of the United States. Inside, they joined 3 other members of Andy's legal team, all working pro bono thanks to the attention his case had received. Maps and documents covered the kitchen table as they rehearsed arguments for the hearing. The central issue, explained Mark Chambers, A constitutional law expert who had volunteered his services is whether the EPA has jurisdiction here at all. The Supreme Court has repeatedly limited the scope of the Clean Water Act, but the agencies keep pushing the boundaries. Exactly, Sarah agreed. The Sackett case established that a property owner can seek judicial review of an EPA compliance order, and the Rapanas decision set limits on what constitutes waters of the United States. We have precedent on our side. Andy listened attentively but found himself distracted by the photographs of his family that lined the walls. His grandfather breaking ground on this very ranch in 1937. His father teaching a young Andy to ride his first horse, Andy and his late wife standing proudly before their newly painted ranch house. What would they think of this battle? Would they tell him to fight or surrender? The courtroom was more crowded than anyone had anticipated. News cameras waited outside the federal courthouse, and the gallery was filled with supporters wearing blue caps bearing the slogan, "Stand with Wilder," that someone had printed and distributed. Andy was overwhelmed by the show of solidarity from people he'd never met. Judge Eleanor Martinez, a no-nonsense jurist with 20 years on the federal bench, called the proceedings to order. The government's attorneys presented their case first, arguing that the EPA had clear statutory authority and that Andy's pond impacted a watershed that eventually flowed to the North Platte River, a traditionally navigable waterway. When it was the defense's turn, Sarah approached the lectern with composed confidence. Your Honor, this case represents exactly the kind of regulatory overreach that the Supreme Court has repeatedly rejected. Mr. Wilder's seasonal stream fails every test established in Rapanas for federal jurisdiction. It flows only intermittently, contains water only after rainfall, and loses its flow entirely before reaching any navigable water. She introduced their expert witness, Dr. James Harrington, a hydrologist who had studied Wyoming's waterways for 3 decades. His testimony was devastating to the government's case. Based on my extensive analysis, Dr. Harrington stated, the ephemeral stream on the Wilder property does not establish a significant nexus to any navigable waterway. The water either evaporates or percolates into groundwater long before reaching any tributary of the North Platte. During cross-examination, the government attorney tried to undermine his credibility. Dr. Harrington, isn't it true that you've been a vocal critic of the EPA's wetlands policies? I'm a critic of scientific inaccuracy, he replied calmly. When agencies ignore hydrological reality to expand their authority, I believe it's my duty as a scientist to point that out. 8 days after the hearing, Andy's phone rang while he was mending fences on the north pasture. He recognized Sarah's number immediately and answered with his heart in his throat. Andy, the ruling just came down, his attorney said, her voice measured in a way that revealed nothing. And, he asked, gripping the phone tighter, Judge Martinez ruled in our favor. She's invalidated the EPA's compliance order on jurisdictional grounds. Andy's knees nearly buckled. He leaned against a fence post, suddenly aware he'd been holding his breath. So the pond stays. The pond stays, Sarah confirmed, her professional composure finally breaking into audible relief. The judge was quite explicit in her opinion. She stated that your seasonal stream does not constitute waters of the United States under any reasonable interpretation of the Clean Water Act or Supreme Court precedent. The victory was sweeter than Andy could have imagined, but it came with a caveat. Starrett explained that the EPA had 30 days to appeal the decision to the circuit court. Given the agency's history of aggressively defending its jurisdictional claims, an appeal was almost certain. Sure enough, 28 days later, the government filed its appeal. What had seemed like a clear victory was now just one battle in what promised to be a prolonged war. It could be a year or more before the appeal is heard, Sarah warned during a conference call with the expanded legal team. And regardless of the outcome at the circuit level, either side could petition for Supreme Court review. So this isn't over, Andy said, resignation in his voice. No, but we've won a significant victory. The burden is now on the EPA to prove the judge erred in her interpretation of the law. That's a much better position than where we started. The appeal process ground forward with glacial slowness while Andy's case continued to draw national attention. He was invited to testify before a House committee examining regulatory overreach. Property rights organizations featured his story in fundraising campaigns. A prestigious law journal published an analysis of his case, suggesting it could potentially set an important precedent limiting federal authority over isolated water features. 6 months after Judge Martinez's ruling, Andy received an unexpected call. It wasn't from Sarah or any member of his legal team, but from a senior official at the EPA itself. Mr. Wilder, I'm calling to discuss a potential resolution to our ongoing litigation, the official said, his tone notably less adversarial than previous EPA communications. Andy immediately contacted Sarah, who arranged a formal meeting with the agency representatives. 2 weeks later, they gathered in a conference room at the federal building in Cheyenne. The agency is prepared to withdraw its appeal under certain conditions, the lead EPA attorney announced once pleasantries had been exchanged. Andy and Sarah exchanged guarded glances. What conditions? Sarah asked. Mr. Wilder would agree to implement additional environmental protections around the pond, the attorney explained, specifically establishing a vegetative buffer zone to prevent erosion and runoff, installing monitoring equipment to track water quality, and submitting annual reports to the State Environmental Authority, not to us. Andy considered this carefully. The buffer zone was already in my original plans. The monitoring equipment and reports are additional expenses and hassle, but not deal breakers. And in exchange, Sarah pressed, the EPA withdraws its appeal and all compliance orders. We recognize the pond as a state-regulated water feature not subject to federal jurisdiction. Mr. Wilder will not face any fines or penalties. After a brief private consultation with his legal team, Andy agreed to the terms. The settlement agreement was drafted over the following days and signed 2 weeks later. As news of the settlement spread, Andy found himself at the center of attention once more. Conservative media hailed it as a victory against government overreach. Environmental groups offered mixed reactions. Some criticized the EPA for backing down, while others acknowledged that the pond was, in fact, an environmental benefit rather than a detriment. On a crisp autumn morning, nearly 15 months after that first threatening letter had arrived in his mailbox, Andy stood beside his pond with a small group of supporters and media representatives. The water sparkled in the sunlight. A great blue heron stalked fish along its edge, and the surrounding vegetation had matured into the buffer zone now formally required by the settlement. 3 years had passed since Andy Wilder's legal battle with the EPA had concluded. The pond, once the center of controversy, had matured into an established feature of Wildwood Ranch, its shores now lush with native grasses and willows. What had begun as a water conservation project had evolved into something far more significant, both for the land and for Andy himself. On a warm spring morning, Andy guided a small tour group along the pond's edge. They weren't reporters or government officials this time, but students from the local agricultural college, eager to learn about sustainable ranching practices and water management in drought-prone regions. Before we built this pond, Andy explained, pointing to the surrounding landscape, this entire area was vulnerable to erosion during heavy rains and offered little habitat diversity. Now we have a stable water source, improved soil retention, and a thriving ecosystem. A young woman raised her hand. Is it true this pond was almost destroyed by government regulations? Andy smiled thoughtfully. It's true that this pond became the center of a legal battle that went far beyond what I ever anticipated. But I think what's more important is what happened afterward. What happened afterward was remarkable. Following the resolution of Andy's case, legislators in Wyoming and 5 other western states had introduced bills clarifying the distinction between federal and state authority over water features on private land. 2 of those bills had passed, creating clearer guidelines for ranchers and farmers. More surprisingly, the EPA itself had initiated a review of its enforcement practices related to agricultural water features, resulting in new internal guidance that emphasized cooperation over confrontation with landowners. Andy had even been invited to participate in a roundtable discussion with agency officials, sharing his perspective on how regulatory approaches could better balance environmental protection with respect for property rights. The biggest lesson I learned, Andy told the students as they completed their circuit of the pond, is that environmental stewardship and private property rights don't have to be in opposition. In fact, they work best when they're aligned. After the students departed, Andy's neighbor Dale joined him for their now traditional afternoon coffee by the pond. The 2 men had created a comfortable seating area beneath a cottonwood tree, a spot that offered a perfect view of the water and the mountains beyond. Hard to believe all the fuss this little body of water caused, Dale remarked, sipping from his thermos. Andy nodded. Sometimes I wonder if any of it would have happened if I'd just torn everything out when that first letter came. And miss your 15 minutes of fame. Dale chuckled. I still have that stand with Wilder cap somewhere. They shared a laugh, but Andy's expression soon turned thoughtful. You know what truly matters to me? My grandfather homesteaded this land when there was nothing here but sagebrush and dreams. My father expanded it during some of the hardest years for American agriculture. I've fought to protect it. And now, he gestured toward the ranch house, where his daughter Rebecca and her husband had recently moved in with their 2 young children after deciding to leave their urban life behind and join the family ranching operation. Now the next generation has a fighting chance to keep this legacy alive, Andy finished. That pond isn't just water storage, it's a statement about our relationship with this land. Dale nodded in understanding. The 2 men fell into comfortable silence, watching a family of geese guide their goslings across the pond's surface. That evening, as the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson, Andy sat on his porch with Rebecca, sharing stories of the ranch's history. His 7-year-old grandson Jason played nearby, occasionally racing to the pond's edge to toss pebbles into the water. "Dad," Rebecca said suddenly, "I found something interesting in Grandpa's old journals while we were settling in." She handed him a weathered leather-bound notebook. Andy recognized it immediately, his father's meticulous record of ranch operations from the 1960s. Rebecca had bookmarked a page dated June 1967. Andy read aloud, "Survey the South Depression again today. Would make an ideal spot for a stock pond someday when finances allow. Government men say too much red tape to be worth the trouble now. Maybe Andy will tackle it when his time comes." His voice caught as he finished reading. "I had no idea," he said softly. "He never mentioned wanting to build a pond there." Rebecca squeezed his hand. "Looks like you finished what he started." Jason came running up the porch steps. "Grandpa, I saw a bald eagle at the pond. It was huge."